I found the envelope on a Tuesday morning, tucked between the radiator and the back wall of the supply closet. I wasn't even looking for anything. I was just trying to find the extra mop heads because Marta had called in sick again, and the floor near the entrance needed doing before we opened. My hand hit something stiff and papery, and I pulled it out thinking it was an old invoice, maybe something that had slipped behind the radiator years ago and been forgotten. It was a plain white envelope, sealed, with nothing written on the outside. I turned it over twice, set it on the shelf next to the cleaning supplies, told myself I'd deal with it later. I didn't open it for 3 days. I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I wasn't a good person because I expected something in return. I wasn't kind because I thought kindness would pay me back someday with interest. I'm 63 years old, and I've lived long enough to know that's not how the world works. Most of the time, you do something decent for somebody, and the world just keeps moving. Nobody notices. Nobody gives you a medal. You go home, you make dinner, you wake up and do it again. I say this because what happened later, what I found in that envelope, I don't want anyone to think I deserved it. I'm not sure I did. I'm not sure I did. I'm not sure any of us deserve the things that find us. What I know is this. Her name was June, and she came into my laundromat on a Thursday night in February, carrying everything she owned in a single-wheeled suitcase and a canvas grocery bag with a broken handle. My laundromat had been in the family since 1987. My late husband Gerald started it. He'd inherited a little money from his uncle, not much, enough to lease the space and buy 8 used washing machines and 4 dryers. We were young and completely clueless, and somehow it worked. We built it up over 30 years, added machines, renovated the bathrooms twice, put in those plastic chairs with the little tables attached so people could sit and do a crossword while they waited. I knew every regular by name. I knew which machines ran hot and which ones needed an extra quarter to get started. That place was mine in a way nothing else had ever been. Gerald died 4 years ago. A stroke, very sudden, a Thursday morning in May. He was fine at breakfast, and then he wasn't, and then he was gone. My daughter kept telling me to sell. She lives in Phoenix now with her husband and 2 kids, and she'd call every Sunday and say, "Mom, you're running that place alone. Mom, it's too much. Mom, you're 60 years old." And I'd say, "I'm fine." And she'd sigh in that particular way she has that sounds exactly like her father, and we'd change the subject. The truth was, the place was struggling. It had been struggling for 2 years. The big chain laundromat opened 6 blocks away, new machines, a loyalty app, free Wi-Fi with actual decent speed. My regulars started drifting over there. I couldn't blame them. I couldn't match any of it. My margins were already thin and getting thinner. I had a line of credit I was drawing on to cover payroll and utilities. I had stopped paying myself a salary in September. I was 3 months behind on the commercial lease by the time June walked in. It was 10:40 at night. I stayed late on Thursdays to do the week's bookkeeping, which mostly meant staring at numbers I didn't want to look at. The front door was unlocked because 2 customers were still there, a young man folding a mountain of baby clothes, and an older woman reading a paperback in the corner chair. The bell above the door rang, and I looked up from my desk, and there she was. She was maybe 70, maybe older. Small woman, not quite 5 feet, white hair cut very short, wire-rimmed glasses that sat slightly crooked on her face. She was wearing a coat that was too light for February and shoes that looked like they'd been walked through a hard winter already. She stood just inside the door and looked around the room with this careful, quiet expression, like she was assessing something without wanting to seem like she was assessing it. I asked if I could help her. She said she had some things to wash. I said, of course, go ahead. She moved to the machine in the far corner, the one I always thought of as the shy machine, because it was tucked back and people only used it when the others were full, and she started loading it slowly. She didn't have much. The suitcase held some folded clothes, a pair of boots, a few books. The grocery bag had some personal items. She washed everything she had, every piece of clothing, every small thing, and while the machine ran, she sat in the chair by the window and looked out at the parking lot. The other customers left. I turned off the overhead lights and left just the working lights on, the soft glow from the machines. It was just the two of us. I brought her a cup of coffee from the little station I keep near the counter. She looked up at me when I set it down and said, "Thank you." Just that. But the way she said it was different from the way people usually say thank you. There was something heavy in it. I asked if she was all right. She said she was fine. I didn't push. I went back to my desk. But I kept watching her from the corner of my eye, this small woman sitting very still in a pool of quiet light, and something in me knew. When her laundry was done, she folded everything carefully and repacked the suitcase. She stood at the door for a moment with her hand on the handle, and I saw her look outside at the parking lot and then look at the street, and then look at the parking lot again. It was 11:30 by then. It was 12 degrees out. I said, "It's late. You're welcome to stay until morning if you need somewhere." She turned and looked at me. She had these gray eyes, very clear, very steady. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out whether I meant it. I meant it. She stayed. That was February. By March, I'd cleared out the supply closet. Not the big one, the small one off the back hallway that we used to store overflow inventory, and put a cot in it, and a space heater and a lamp. My daughter called, and I didn't mention it. My friend Barbara came by for coffee on a Saturday, and I introduced June as my helper, and Barbara gave me a look I chose to ignore. June started working almost immediately. I hadn't asked her to. The second week she was there, I came in on a Monday morning to find the bathroom tiles scrubbed white for the first time in probably 2 years. The week after that, she'd reorganized the supply shelves in a way that actually made sense. Everything labeled, nothing expired or duplicated. She fixed the leak under the utility sink with supplies she'd found in the hardware bin and a video she'd watched on the little tablet I'd given her. I asked where she learned to do that. She said she'd had to learn a lot of things over the years. I didn't push. That was how it was with June. She gave you what she wanted to give you and nothing more. And after a while, you stopped asking because you understood that the asking made her close up a little, and the not asking let her open up in her own time, in her own small ways. What I learned over months, then years, she'd grown up in rural Vermont. She had a brother she didn't speak to. She liked strong tea and disliked anything with artificial lemon flavoring. She had a precise and almost alarming memory for numbers. She could look at a receipt once and recall every line item a week later. She read constantly, thick, serious books with small print, history, and biography, and sometimes dense, scientific texts that she'd mark up in pencil in her tiny, careful handwriting. She was wonderful with the customers. Not in a warm, chatty way. She wasn't that kind of person, but in a way that made people feel steadied. An older man named Frank came in every Tuesday with his grandson's sports uniforms, always stressed, always running late, and June would have his machine started and his change sorted before he'd finished getting through the door. A young woman who came in on Wednesday evenings and sometimes cried quietly in the corner chair. June would just sit near her, not speaking, not intruding, just present. The young woman told me once that June was the best listener she'd ever met. I said June didn't say much, and the young woman said, "Exactly. I paid her what I could, which was not much. I told her that, and she said it was fine. She didn't need much. I told her the room was small, and she said she'd slept in smaller places. I told her I didn't know how long the business would last, and she said, 'None of us know how long anything will last.'" She had a way of saying things like that. Quietly, without drama, like she was stating a simple and obvious fact. After a while, I found it comforting rather than unsettling. She wasn't being grim, she was just being accurate. My daughter came to visit in the summer just over a year after June arrived. I had not told her about June. I had not lied exactly. I had simply not mentioned it. The same way I hadn't mentioned the state of the finances, or the letter from the landlord about the lease renegotiation, or the fact that I'd stopped going to my Thursday evening book club because I couldn't afford to split the dinner checks anymore. She arrived on a Friday afternoon and found June wiping down the machine fronts with a methodical, careful attention that was very characteristic of her. My daughter stared. I made introductions. My daughter smiled the smile that means she is not smiling and said it was wonderful to meet June, and could she speak to me in the back, please? We stood in the hallway, and she kept her voice low, but her voice has always carried, a thing she got from Gerald. She said, "Mom." I said, "Yes." She said, "You have a stranger living in your supply closet?" I said she wasn't a stranger. She said, "How long?" I said, 14 months. She said something then that I won't repeat because she didn't mean it the way it came out, and she knew it immediately, and she stopped and put her hands over her face and said, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I worry about you. I worry about you so much." "I know," I said. She stayed the weekend. By Sunday evening, she and June had figured out that they were both interested in desert ecology, which is not a subject that comes up often in conversations in my laundromat, and they were deep into a conversation about soil composition in the Sonoran Desert. My daughter hugged me goodbye at the car and whispered, "She's unusual." I said, "Yes, she is." She said, "Okay." She drove away. I went back inside. June was setting up the chairs for the next morning, the small, careful motions of a person who knows exactly how they want things to be. Year 2 was harder than year 1. Year 3 was harder than year 2. The big chain opened a second location, 4 blocks in the other direction, which effectively boxed me in. I lost 6 more regulars that fall. The lease renegotiation went badly. My landlord was not unkind, but he was running a business too, and the market rate had increased significantly, and there was only so much he could do. My line of credit limit was now something I thought about the way you think about a rope when you're hanging from it. I didn't talk to June about the finances. She knew. I didn't know how she knew, because I hadn't told her anything explicit. But one evening, I came out of the back after an especially discouraging call with my accountant, and she handed me a cup of tea and sat across from me and said, "How bad is it?" I told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You've kept this place alive for a long time. Gerald would think so too." I asked how she knew about Gerald. She said there was a framed photo of us on the wall near the register. She said he looked like someone who built things that lasted. I didn't say anything for a while after that. The letter came on a Tuesday in October. I recognized the law firm name on the envelope, and my stomach dropped before I'd even opened it, the way your body knows things before your brain catches up. It was a formal notice. My landlord's building had been purchased by a property development company. My current lease would be honored through the end of the term, 8 months away. After that, the building was slated for demolition and redevelopment. There would be no renewal option. 8 months. I sat with that for a long time. I called my daughter that evening and told her, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, come to Phoenix, just come." And part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to fold everything up and drive southwest and sit in her backyard in the warm air and let someone else worry about machines and leases and numbers. But I thought about Gerald starting this place with 8 used washing machines and a belief that people needed somewhere decent to bring their things. I thought about Frank with his grandson's uniforms and the young woman who cried on Wednesday evenings and the hundreds small, ordinary people who'd been coming through my door for 30 years. I told my daughter I needed some time to think. I told June the next morning. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, 8 months is still time. I said I didn't know what I'd do with 8 months, that I hadn't already tried. She didn't answer that. She went back to what she was doing. That was October. In November, I started looking at other locations, spaces I couldn't afford. In December, I applied for a small business loan I was denied. In January, I applied for 2 more programs, one local, one state, and was denied for both. By February, 4 years after June had first walked through my door in her 2 light coat, I was looking at the numbers and thinking about calling a business broker. The envelope was sitting on my desk when I came in on a Thursday morning. Not the envelope from behind the radiator, that one I'd found earlier in November when I was clearing out the supply closet. I'd put it in my desk drawer unopened. I don't know why. I think part of me was afraid of it. It was addressed to no one. It was sealed. It had been hidden, and somehow I felt like opening it was crossing a line I hadn't been invited to cross. But this was a different envelope. This one was on my desk, and it had my name on it. My full name, Margaret, not the Maggie that everyone called me, but Margaret. In small, careful handwriting I recognized immediately. June was not in the building. Her room was empty. The cot was made with the same precision she applied to everything. Her books were gone. Her few personal items were gone. Only the space heater remained, and the lamp, and the kettle she bought herself 3 years ago at the church rummage sale. I sat down in my chair and held the envelope for a long time. Then I opened it. Inside was a folded letter, 2 pages in her small handwriting, and a check. I read the letter first. She wrote that she had stayed longer than she planned. She wrote that she had planned, originally, to stay only a few weeks, to get herself together, to figure out the next step. She wrote that she had not expected to find a place she wanted to stay or a person she wanted to know, and that both things had caught her by surprise, and that she was grateful in a way she had not expected to feel again, because gratitude requires a certain kind of openness that she had, for a long time before she met me, closed off in herself. She wrote, I was not always who you knew me as. I was, for a long time, someone else entirely. The people I worked with called me Dr. Calloway. I built 3 companies over 30 years. At the height of it, I had more money than any single person needs and more responsibilities than any single person should carry, and eventually I carried them very badly, and people were hurt by that, and I stepped away. I walked away from everything. I needed to understand what I was without all of it. I needed to be nobody for a while and find out if there was still something worth being. She wrote, you let me be nobody. You didn't push. You gave me work when I needed to feel useful and quiet when I needed to feel nothing, and tea at the moments when those 2 things met. I don't know how you knew what I needed. I think you just paid attention, and sometimes that's enough. She wrote, the check is for the new location on Birch Street. I drove past it last month and looked up the lease rate. The number on the check should cover the first 3 years and some renovation. It's already cleared. Use it. She wrote, Gerald built something that lasted. You kept it alive. That's worth more than the building. At the bottom of the second page, in letters slightly larger than the rest, like she'd wanted to make sure I saw it, don't you dare not use it. I looked at the check for a long time. The number had more zeros than I was comfortable looking at. At the bottom left in the memo line, she'd written simply, overdue. I called my daughter. She was at work, and she picked up on the 3rd ring, her voice already shifted into efficient mode, and I said her name, and something in my voice made her say, Mom, what happened? What's wrong? And I said nothing's wrong and started crying, which made her more alarmed. And it took me a while to get the story out in a comprehensible order. She was quiet for a long moment at the end. Then she said, the woman who lived in your supply closet for 4 years was a doctor who built companies? I said, yes. She said, and she just left you a check. I said, yes. She said, Mom. I said, I know. She flew in the following weekend. She sat across from me at the kitchen table with the letter and read it twice, slowly, and when she was done, she set it down and looked at me and said, she really paid attention. I said, yes. She did. My daughter looked at the letter again. She said, you paid attention first. The location on Birch Street had been a dry cleaner that went out of business during the pandemic. It was bigger than my old space, better light, better ventilation. We renovated over 6 weeks. I kept the same plastic chairs with the little tables attached because I couldn't bring myself to replace them. I added 8 new machines, replaced the older ones, put in proper Wi-Fi and a small lending library in the corner, paperbacks, free to take, free to leave, the honor system. Frank came to the opening with his grandson. The young woman from Wednesday evenings brought flowers. Barbara cried, which surprised me because Barbara is not a crier. My daughter stayed for the opening and then flew back to Phoenix. At the airport, she hugged me for a long time and said, I'm sorry I kept telling you to sell. I said, you were worried. She said, I was wrong. I said, you were both. She laughed. It sounded like Gerald. She laughed. It sounded like Gerald. I have heard from June once since she left. a postcard, no return address, a photograph of a coastline I didn't recognize, rocky and cold and beautiful. On the back, in her small, precise handwriting, strong tea here. Good books. You would like it. I have the postcard on the wall behind the register, next to the framed photograph of Gerald and me from the early days, the two of us standing in front of 8 used washing machines with the specific confidence of people who don't yet know what they're getting into. I think about what she wrote sometimes, about being nobody for a while and finding out if there's still something worth being. I think about how she walked in on a Thursday night in February with a broken-handled grocery bag and a careful expression, and how I didn't ask too many questions, and how she didn't either, and how somehow that was exactly enough. There are people in this world who carry more than they show you. There are people who need, for a little while, to set down everything they've been and just exist somewhere quiet. I was lucky enough to have a quiet place to offer. I was lucky enough to offer it. My granddaughter visited last spring. She's 9. She's Gerald's eyes and my stubbornness in a very small package, and she asked me about the postcard. I told her a woman named June had sent it. She asked where June was, and I said I didn't know exactly. She asked if I missed her, and I thought about it for a moment, really thought about it, and I said, every day. My granddaughter considered this and then said, did she miss you? I looked at the postcard. The rocky coastline, the cold, beautiful light, the good books, and the strong tea. I said, I think so. I think that's why she wrote. The machines were running. The afternoon light came through the front windows the way it always does at 3 o'clock, long and warm across the tile floor. Frank's grandson was in the corner doing homework. The lending library had 3 new paperbacks someone had left that morning. Some days I think the whole point of a life is to find out how much you can hold. Not money, not square footage, not the impressive things that look good from a distance. Just how much you can hold, how many people, how much quiet, how much of someone else's weight without even being asked. I held June's, she held mine. That seems like enough. That seems honestly like more than enough. I've thought a lot about why any of this happened. Not in a mystical way, not in the way people sometimes talk about the universe rewarding you or fate stepping in. I don't think it works like that. I think it's simpler and harder than that. I think what happened is that 2 people were both in the process of losing something, and instead of turning away from each other, they didn't. That's it. That's the whole thing. June had walked away from a life that looked like success from the outside and had apparently felt like a slow collapse from the inside. She built companies, led people, accumulated the kind of wealth that most of us only see as a number on a page. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, something had gone wrong, not just with the work, but with who she was inside the work. She told me in her letter that people had been hurt. She didn't elaborate, and I never asked. What I understood was that she had looked at herself clearly, which takes more courage than most people ever manage, and she hadn't liked everything she saw, and she had chosen to step back and sit with that rather than push forward and bury it. That's not weakness. I've come to believe that's one of the harder things a person can do. And I was losing a building. I was losing the business Gerald and I had built together, the thing I poured 30 years into, the thing I'd been holding on to, partly because I loved it, and partly because letting go felt like losing him again. I was exhausted and scared and too proud to say either of those things out loud to anyone who might have actually helped. What June gave me wasn't just money. What she gave me first, before the check, before any of it, was the experience of being known without performing. She watched me for 4 years. She watched how I treated Frank when he was running late, and how I sat near the young woman who cried on Wednesday evenings without making it into something, and how I talked about Gerald like he was still somehow in the room with me, because in that building, he was. She paid attention, and she recognized something in me. Not that I was good exactly, because I'm not sure goodness is the right word for just doing what seems obvious, but that I was trying to hold something worth holding. I think that's what we owe each other, honestly. Attention. real attention, not the kind where you're waiting for your turn to speak or scanning for what someone can do for you, but the kind where you actually look at a person and try to understand what they're carrying. June was carrying something enormous when she walked into my laundromat that February night. I didn't know what it was. I didn't need to know. I just saw someone who needed somewhere to be, and I had somewhere. That's the part I keep coming back to. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I didn't sacrifice anything that cost me deeply in the moment. I had a small room and a space heater and a cot and a willingness to not ask too many questions. That was the whole of it. And I think the reason it mattered, the reason June stayed, the reason she paid attention, the reason she left what she left is precisely because I wasn't calculating. I wasn't being kind in order to get something back. I was just being decent because the alternative was to let someone walk out into 12-degree weather, and I couldn't do that. The way I see it now, the life you build through small, honest choices accumulates. Not into wealth, not necessarily, not always into anything you can measure, but into a kind of character. And character is what determines who shows up for you and when and how. June showed up because she could see mine. That's not luck. That's cause and effect of the quietest kind. My granddaughter asked me if I missed June, and I said yes, every day. I meant it, not because of the check, but because she was one of the few people in my life who looked at me, really looked, and saw something worth seeing. That's rarer than $180 million. That's the thing I hope she found on that rocky coastline, wherever she is. Someone looking back at her the same way.